had pressed 14. I knew I had, because I always counted the raised dots under my finger twice before committing, a habit I'd built in 3 weeks the way you build any habit you never wanted, out of necessity rather than choice. 3 weeks was not very long, in the grand scheme of a life. It was long enough, though, to learn the particular grammar of a world without sight, the way a curb announces itself half a second before your cane finds it, the way a room's size can be guessed from the way sound bounces off its walls, the way people's voices change, almost without exception, once they realize you can't see them looking at you differently. I had not been born blind. That distinction mattered more than I expected it to. In the early days, the strange grief of losing something rather than never having it, the phantom habit of turning toward a sound before remembering that turning wouldn't help me see it anymore. My doctors used the word idiopathic so often in the first week that I started saying it along with them under my breath, half joke, half plea for a different word to eventually replace it. The Holloway Medical Tower had a newer panel than most, brass buttons with braille worn just enough to feel authentic and not enough to feel reliable. I wrote it twice a week for my ophthalmology follow-ups, always to 14, always counting the same 4 rows down from the top before pressing, a small, private ritual that had become, in its own strange way, one of the few things in my new life I felt fully certain about. This time, the car didn't stop at 14. I felt it in my stomach first, the specific sinking awareness that comes before your mind has caught up to what your body already knows. The elevator kept climbing. I counted the seconds instead of the floors, since floors were no longer something I could verify, and the seconds kept adding up past what 14 floors should have taken. I reached for my cane, more out of instinct than need, and pressed the emergency intercom button with my other hand. Nothing, not even the small click of static that usually meant someone on the other end was choosing whether to respond. The elevator slowed. Not with the practiced, gentle deceleration of a normal stop, but with a kind of held-breath stillness, like the whole car was waiting for permission before it dared to open. The air changed first. Colder, cleaner, carrying the particular sterile hush of very expensive spaces, the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. Then came the scent, and it hit me somewhere below language, somewhere my body understood faster than my mind did. 2 alphas. Close, powerful enough that even 3 weeks into blindness, even with senses still recalibrating from the sudden loss of sight, I knew instantly what I was smelling. Amber and something like controlled fire, sharp and disciplined. And beneath it, a second scent, cedar and rain-soaked earth, warmer, quieter, but no less commanding. I had never smelled 2 alpha signatures that strong standing that close together, not once in my entire life. The doors opened. I stood very still, cane held slightly in front of me, every part of my body screaming at me to step backward into the elevator and press any button at all, any floor, anywhere but here. "You're not supposed to be here," a voice said, cold, precise, the kind of voice that had never once needed to raise itself to be obeyed. "I pressed 14, I said, and I hated how thin my own voice sounded against hers. "The panel must be malfunctioning." A pause. I could feel her considering me, the particular weight of an alpha's attention when it settles fully on someone, assessing threat before it assesses anything else. I stood as still as I could manage, cane angled slightly forward, every instinct I had screaming that stillness was safer than movement in a room I couldn't map. "She's blind," a second voice said, softer, closer to my left. Not a question. An observation made with a kind of gentleness the first voice hadn't offered. "I know that," I said, sharper than I intended. "I can hear you talking about me like I'm not the one standing here." There was a small silence, and then, unexpectedly, the second voice laughed, low and surprised. "Fair enough," she said. "I'm Natalie. That's my sister, Alina. You've wandered into our floor, which almost never happens, mostly because it's supposed to be impossible." "Vivian," I said, because it seemed rude not to offer something back, even standing in a place I clearly wasn't meant to be. "Vivian Chen, I promise I'm not here on purpose." "We believe you," Natalie said. "The panel's been glitching for weeks. Maintenance keeps promising to fix it and keeps not fixing it." Alina hadn't spoken again. I could feel her still watching me, and something about the quality of her silence made the hair on my arms rise, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to recognition, a low hum under my skin I had no name for and didn't trust. "We'll take you back down," Alina finally said. "Natalie, get security to reset the panel properly this." The window shattered before she finished the sentence. I didn't see it happen, obviously. I felt it happen, a violent, percussive crack followed by a spray of something fine and cold against my face, glass. I realized a half-second later, glass and cold air rushing in from 14 floors higher than it should have been able to reach me. "Down," Alina said, and her voice had changed entirely, flattened into something razor-precise. A hand closed around my arm, not gentle, not asking permission, simply moving me fast, low, behind something solid. I heard the second shot before I understood the first one had actually been a shot, and not simply glass failing on its own. The sound of it landed differently than I expected. Less a bang, and more a sharp, flat crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible for me to place with any confidence. My cane slipped from my hand. I felt for it blindly, panic rising in a way that had nothing rehearsed about it, nothing my 3 weeks of adjustment had prepared me for. 3 weeks had taught me to navigate stairs and count buttons. Nothing had taught me how to navigate gunfire without eyes to track its source. "Leave it," Natalie said, close on my other side now, her hand finding my shoulder, steady in a way that felt different from Alina's grip, less about control and more about anchoring. "I've got you. Move when I move." I moved when she moved. I had no other choice, and some small, humiliated part of me hated how completely I had no other choice. I counted the steps as we went, an old habit resurfacing under pressure, though the numbers meant nothing anymore, no map to attach them to, just a way of keeping my own mind from splintering entirely. We reached what I could only identify by touch and echo as a reinforced door. Heavy, cold, sliding open at some code, Alina entered too fast for me to track by sound. Inside, the air was different again, closer, quieter, the specific hush of a room built to keep sound in as much as danger out. "Safe room," Natalie said, answering the question I hadn't asked yet. "You're all right, you're safe." "I don't feel safe," I said, and my voice finally cracked the way I'd been holding it together not to. "I don't even know where I am. I came here for an eye appointment." "I know," Alina said, and for the first time her voice lost some of its edge. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but you saw something you weren't supposed to see, whether you realize it or not, and that makes this considerably more complicated than a wrong elevator button." "I didn't see anything," I said. "I'm blind, in case that detail got lost somewhere in the gunfire." There was a pause, and then, absurdly, Natalie laughed again, short and surprised, quickly swallowed. "She's got a point," she said. "This isn't funny," Alina said. "No," Natalie agreed, "but she's still got a point." I sat down on something, a bench, cold under my hands, and tried to breathe through the adrenaline still flooding my system. 3 weeks ago, my biggest problem had been learning to count stairs. Now I was sitting in a bulletproof room with 2 alpha strangers whose sense alone made my chest feel tight in ways I refused to examine. "Who was shooting at you?" I asked, once my voice was steady enough to trust. "Neither of them," answered immediately. "That," Alina finally said, "is a considerably longer conversation than we have time for right now." "This isn't the first time," I said, piecing it together from the speed of their reactions, the practiced, wordless coordination between them. "Is it?" "No," Natalie admitted, quieter than before. "It isn't." I sat with that for a long moment, the cold bench under my hands, the twin alpha scents surrounding me on either side, close enough that some traitorous part of my body wanted to lean into both of them at once, wanted it with an intensity that frightened me more than the gunfire had. I didn't understand yet what that pull meant. I would, soon enough, and understanding it would turn out to be far more complicated than any of the danger that came before it. Alina was the one who spoke first once the immediate danger had settled into the tense, watchful quiet of a threat gone temporarily elsewhere. Her voice, up close and without gunfire distorting it, was precise in a way that felt almost architectural, every word placed exactly where she wanted it. "You can't go home tonight," she said. "Excuse me." "Whoever was shooting saw you exit that elevator with us," she said. "That makes you a witness, whether or not you actually witnessed anything useful. We're not willing to send you back into a situation where that becomes your problem to survive alone." "That's not your decision," I said, and I felt my spine straighten despite the fear still sitting heavy in my chest. "Your enemies seeing me does not make my life yours to manage. I have a home. I have a brother who needs me there tonight, not tomorrow, not whenever it's convenient for your security situation." Silence, briefly, and then Natalie's voice, gentler, testing the edges of my anger rather than pushing against it. "Tell us about your brother," she said. I hesitated. I didn't owe them anything, not my history, not my family, not one more piece of myself than I'd already been forced to give up in the last 20 minutes. But something about the way Natalie asked, without demand in it, without the assumption that I would simply answer because she'd asked, loosened something in my chest. "Sage," I said. "He's 6. Our mother isn't." I stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't require more explanation than I was ready to give two strangers. "She isn't well, isn't safe some days. I check on him every evening. If I don't show up tonight and she's had a bad day, I don't know what that looks like for him." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences before it. I could feel something shift between the two alphas, some unspoken decision passing between twins who had clearly spent their entire lives communicating in exactly that way, without needing words for it. "We'll take you to him," Alina said. "Tonight, with security. And then you're both coming back here, whether you like the sound of that or not, until we understand what we're actually dealing with." "That's not a compromise," I said. "That's just you deciding for me with extra steps. It's the only version of tonight where your brother is safe, and you're not walking back into a building with an active shooter interest in you," Alina said, flat, final. "You can be angry about the delivery. I'd rather you be angry and alive." I didn't have a response to that. Some small, exhausted part of me was, humiliatingly, grateful, even as the rest of me resented exactly how little say I'd been given in my own protection. "Fine," I said, "but we leave now. Every minute we don't is a minute I don't know if he's all right." The drive to my mother's house took 11 minutes, which I knew because I counted them, the same way I counted everything now, seconds and turns, and the small vibrations of a car moving through a city I could no longer watch pass by. Natalie sat beside me in the back seat. I could feel her attention on me the entire way, not intrusive, just present, the way you check on someone you're worried about without needing to say so out loud. I spent most of those 11 minutes running through possibilities I didn't want to run through, the specific catalog of bad days my mother was capable of, each one worse than the last, each one ending, in my imagination, with some version of Sage frightened and alone. "You've done this before," Natalie said quietly, somewhere around the 6th minute, not a question so much as an observation offered gently, giving me room to correct her if she was wrong. "More times than I want to count," I admitted. "Usually it's a phone call that ends too fast or doesn't get answered at all. This is the first time I haven't been able to get there on my own." She didn't offer empty reassurance, didn't tell me it would be fine, a kindness I recognized and appreciated more than I expected to. She just let her hand rest lightly, near mine on the seat, not quite touching, an offer rather than an assumption. The house smelled the way it always did before I even reached the door, stale cigarette smoke layered over something sweeter and more chemical that I'd learned, over the years, not to ask questions about. The porch step creaked under my foot exactly where it always creaked, a small, familiar landmark in a house that had stopped feeling safe long before I lost my sight. The front door was unlocked. That alone told me something was wrong, because my mother locked that door obsessively on her good days and forgot it entirely on her bad ones. "Sage," I called, stepping inside, cane sweeping the floor in front of me out of habit rather than trust. "Sage, it's me." Nothing. No footsteps, no small voice answering, None of the chaotic, cheerful noise a 6-year-old usually made simply existing in a room. Muffled crying, Natalie said quietly close behind me. Down the hall, behind you and to the left. I moved faster than I probably should have, cane forgotten, one hand trailing the wall for guidance. The hallway smelled worse the further I went. Stale air and something like fear, sharp and specific. The kind of smell a house takes on when something has gone badly wrong inside it. The storage closet door was locked from the outside. I found the latch by touch, hands shaking, and heard Sage's crying stop for one terrible second, replaced by held breath, before starting again, muffled and desperate, once he heard my voice through the door. "Vivi," he said, small and broken. "Vivi, I'm scared." "I'm here," I said, working the latch, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. "I'm right here, I've got you, I'm not leaving." The latch gave. I pulled the door open and Sage collided into me before I'd even fully registered the door was open, small arms locking around my waist, his whole body shaking. He smelled like dust and old cardboard, the particular smell of a closet meant for storage, never for a child, and something in me broke a little further at the discovery. I felt Alina move past us into the house, her steps fast and controlled, searching the other rooms with the particular economy of someone trained for exactly this kind of situation. I didn't ask what she found. I didn't need to. My mother wasn't the kind of person who stayed to face consequences, and the empty, unresponsive silence of the rest of the house told its own story. "How long?" I asked Sage quietly, holding him tighter. "I don't know," he said into my shirt. It was still light out. It was fully dark now. I did the math without wanting to, hours, plural, alone in a locked closet, and felt something in my chest go cold and hard in a way I'd never let myself feel toward my own mother before. Some final door closing on patience I hadn't realized I was still extending. "You're not going back there," I told him, and for the first time since the elevator, my voice held zero uncertainty in it. "Not tonight, not after this." "Where are we going?" he asked, small and hopeful in a way that broke something in me all over again. I didn't have a complete answer, but Natalie's hand found my shoulder, steady, and Alina's voice came from somewhere near the front door, low and certain in a way that, despite everything, made the cold, hard thing in my chest ease slightly. "Somewhere safe," she said. "I promise you that much." I didn't trust promises easily, not from anyone, and especially not from two powerful strangers I'd known for less than an hour. But something in the way she said it, plain and unadorned, without performance in it, made me want to believe her anyway. The penthouse, once we arrived, was nothing like I expected a fortress to feel like. It smelled like clean linen and something faintly floral, lavender maybe, layered under the same amber and cedar rain scents I now recognized as distinctly, separately theirs. Sage fell asleep within the hour, exhausted past the point of fear, in a room Natalie had apparently arranged in the time it took me to walk him there, small enough furniture, a nightlight I could hear humming faintly, blankets that smelled like they'd been freshly washed rather than pulled from some unused guest closet. "You didn't have to do all this so fast," I said, standing in the doorway, listening to his breathing even out. "We didn't know how much time we'd have," Natalie said simply. "Seemed safer to assume not much." I sat with them afterward in a quiet living room, a bowl of soup pressed gently into my hands by Alina, who set it down without commentary, without waiting for thanks, the way you do something for someone when you've decided their comfort matters more than their acknowledgement of it. "I need to understand something," I said, once I'd eaten enough to feel steadier. "Earlier, in the elevator, before the shooting started, there was something—" I struggled for the right word, aware of how strange it would sound spoken aloud. "Something happened between us, I felt it and I don't think I imagined it." The silence that followed was long enough that I began to regret asking. "You didn't imagine it," Alina finally said, quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her yet. "We felt it too, both of us, at the same time." "What is it?" I asked. "A mate bond," Natalie said. "It's rare enough on its own. A shared one between twins toward the same person." She stopped, seeming to search for words she clearly hadn't expected to need tonight. It's not something either of us has ever experienced before. We didn't expect it. We're not entirely sure what to do with it." "I don't know what to do with it either," I admitted. "I met you an hour ago, under gunfire. I don't even know your last names." "Vale," Alina said. "And for what it's worth, the bond doesn't require you to do anything with it. Our instincts recognized you. That doesn't mean you owe us an answer. Not tonight. Maybe not ever if that's what you decide." "What happens if I decide it's not what I want?" I asked, needing to hear the answer before I could let myself trust anything else they said tonight. "Then we respect that," Natalie said, without hesitation. "It would hurt. I won't pretend otherwise. But a bond isn't a leash and it isn't a debt. If it's not what you want, we'll find a way to carry that, the same way we'd carry anything else." I sat with that for a long moment, surprised by how much the sentence mattered to me, how different it felt from every assumption I'd braced myself to fight against the moment I first smelled 2 alpha signatures that strong. "Good," I said finally, "because I'm not deciding anything tonight. Tonight I just want to know my brother is safe and that nobody's going to shoot through another window." "Fair," Natalie said, and I could hear the small smile in her voice. "We can work with that." The days that followed settled into something I hadn't expected. A quiet, careful rhythm built less on grand gestures and more on small, repeated proof that I could trust the space I was in. Alina handled the practical architecture of our safety, security rotations, encrypted communications, careful management of exactly who knew where Sage and I were staying. She was efficient in a way that occasionally read as cold to strangers, I imagined, but I learned quickly that her efficiency was its own form of care, a way of loving people by making sure nothing dangerous could reach them. I noticed within the first 2 days that she'd had every piece of furniture in my section of the penthouse arranged with careful, consistent logic, nothing left randomly placed, everything positioned exactly where a memory map could hold it without confusion. Natalie handled the softer architecture, the things that made a temporary refuge start to feel, almost against my will, like something closer to home. She learned, within days, exactly how I liked my coffee, the specific way I needed furniture described to me once and never moved without warning afterward, the particular tone of voice that meant Sage needed a distraction rather than a lecture. She started leaving small verbal notes taped, so to speak, into our daily routine, mentioning aloud whenever something in a room had changed. A new vase, a rearranged cushion, small courtesies that cost her nothing and meant everything to someone rebuilding an entire spatial memory of the world. Neither of them touched me without asking first, not once, not even in the small, casual ways people often touch each other without thinking. I noticed the restraint before I understood how much it meant to me, how rare it was to be given that kind of careful, consistent choice by anyone, let alone 2 alphas whose instincts, I now understood, were pulling them toward me with an intensity I could sometimes feel humming in the air between us. There was a night early on when Alina reached toward my shoulder out of pure instinct, caught herself mid-motion, and simply asked instead, "May I?" I said yes, and the brief, steady weight of her hand afterward felt like more of a gift for having been offered rather than assumed. Sage adjusted faster than I expected, the particular resilience of a 6-year-old who had learned to find safety wherever it was offered without asking too many questions about why it had taken so long to arrive. Alina taught him to play chess on a tactile board she'd apparently had custom made within 2 days of meeting him, patient in a way that surprised me every time I overheard it, explaining each piece's movement 3, 4, 5 times without a trace of impatience in her voice. Natalie told him bedtime stories in a low, warm voice I found myself listening to from the hallway more nights than I wanted to admit, unwilling to interrupt whatever fragile, growing trust was building between them. One afternoon, I overheard Sage ask Alina, with the blunt honesty only children manage, whether she and Natalie were going to be his family now. I froze in the hallway, waiting, afraid of what answer either of us might not be ready to hear yet. "That depends on some things that aren't decided yet," Alina told him, careful and honest even with a 6-year-old. "But whatever happens, you and your sister are safe here for as long as you need to be. That part isn't in question." It wasn't the answer I expected. And it was, somehow, exactly the right one, honest about the uncertainty without making that uncertainty feel like abandonment. One evening, unable to sleep, I found my way to the kitchen by memory, counting the walls the way I'd learned to count everything now, and found Natalie already there, midnight tea steaming between her hands. "Can't sleep either," she said, not a question. "Too much has happened," I said, settling into the chair across from her, guided by the sound of her voice. 3 weeks ago, the biggest decision in my life was learning where the second stair landing was. Now I've got assassins and mate bonds and a 6-year-old who calls your sister Chess Lady. Natalie laughed, quiet and real. He's not wrong to. She's fully invested in that nickname now. We sat in comfortable silence for a while before she spoke again, more carefully this time. "Can I ask you something? About before the blindness?" "You can ask," I said. "I might not have a comfortable answer." "What happened?" I turned my cup slowly in my hands, feeling the warmth of it settle into my palms before I answered. "That's the strange part," I said. "Nobody's been able to tell me. One evening I could see. The next morning I couldn't. No trauma, no accident, no family history that explains it. My doctors called it idiopathic, which is just a polite word for we don't actually know." I felt Natalie go very still across from me, a stillness with weight in it, the particular quiet of someone connecting information she hadn't expected to connect. "What?" I asked. "You went quiet in a way that feels like it means something." "It might," she said slowly. "We should talk to Alina about this. Tomorrow. I don't want to alarm you tonight without more information, but there's a possibility here that matters." I didn't sleep well after that conversation, turning her careful, unfinished sentence over and over. Some instinct in me already suspecting, before I had any proof, that my blindness was not the meaningless accident I'd spent 3 weeks grieving. The following morning, Alina sat across from me at the same table, a folder open in front of her that I couldn't read but could hear her fingers moving across. "I want to run some tests," she said. "Blood work, genetic markers, a full retinal scan. I have a theory, and I need evidence before I say it out loud, because if I'm right, it changes everything about how dangerous the last 3 weeks actually were." "Say it anyway," I said. "I've earned that much, I think." She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "Natalie and I run a biotech company," she finally said. "Most of our work is in retinal regeneration. We've spent 4 years developing a treatment for exactly the kind of degeneration you're describing. Sudden, unexplained, no trauma or genetic markers in your existing records." "You think you can fix this?" I said, and I heard my own voice waver in a way I hadn't allowed it to in weeks. "I think," she said carefully, "that your blindness might not have happened naturally at all. There's a rival company, Meridian Vault, that we've suspected for over a year of developing something considerably darker than a treatment. A compound that induces exactly this kind of damage, paired with a controlled antidote they intend to sell exclusively, at whatever price the desperate can be made to pay." The room went very quiet around me. "You think someone did this to me on purpose?" I said. "I think it's possible," Alina said. "And if it's true, it means you didn't wander into that elevator by accident in the way any of us assumed. It means you may have already been a target before you ever pressed a single button." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the ground of the last 3 weeks shift beneath a version of the story I hadn't been prepared to consider. My blindness, the strange doctors, the unexplained damage, none of it random, all of it, possibly, a piece of something far larger and far more deliberate than bad luck. "Run the tests," I said, once I trusted my voice again. "I want to know. Whatever it costs to know, I want to know." The testing took 4 days. Blood drawn, genetic panels run twice for accuracy. A retinal scan performed by a specialist Alina, trusted enough to bring directly into the penthouse, rather than risk moving me through public spaces again. Each step of it carried its own small, private terror. The blood work felt almost ordinary, familiar in its clinical routine, a needle and a vial and a bandage pressed over the site afterward. The genetic markers took longer, run twice deliberately, Alina explaining patiently that a single result, however clean, wasn't enough to justify the risk of what might come next. The retinal scan was the hardest part, machinery pressed close to my face. A bright light I couldn't see but could feel as warmth against closed eyelids. The specialist's low, murmured commentary, the only thing anchoring me through the discomfort of it. Natalie sat with me through every single appointment, never once suggesting I didn't need the company, never once making her presence about anything other than simply being there. Alina reviewed results the moment they arrived, sometimes late into the night, her focus so complete that Natalie occasionally had to physically remind her to eat. On the third day, waiting for the final scan results, I asked Alina a question that had been sitting in my chest since the conversation began. "If this works," I said, "what happens to everyone else, the other people this might have been done to?" She looked up from her folder, something in her expression shifting, softening slightly at the question. "If it works on you," she said, "it becomes the first confirmed proof our treatment can reverse this specific compound's damage. That's not nothing. That's leverage evidence, a foundation for helping everyone else who's been hurt the same way." "So it's not just about me," I said. "No," she agreed. "It never was, not entirely. But that doesn't make what happens to you any less important to us. Both things can be true." On the fourth day, Alina sat across from me with the results, her voice steady, but carrying a weight I could hear even without seeing her face. "There's a chemical signature in your retinal tissue," she said. "Synthetic, not naturally occurring. It matches, almost exactly, a compound we've been tracking for over a year, one we believe Meridian Vault has been testing, quietly, on people who wouldn't be missed or believed if they raised concerns." "Why me?" I asked. "I'm nobody. I don't work for either company. I've never even heard of Meridian Vault before this week." "We don't know yet," Alina admitted. "It's possible you were random. It's possible you weren't. Either way, the compound is a match, and that means, if you're willing, you may be the first genuine candidate for the treatment we've spent 4 years building." Hope is a dangerous thing to feel after weeks of learning to live without it. I felt it anyway, sharp and frightening, rising in my chest before I could stop it. "What are the risks?" I asked, because I needed to ask that before I let myself want it too badly. "Real ones," Alina said honestly. "The treatment is experimental. It's worked in trials, but never yet on a case with this specific compound signature. There's a real possibility it doesn't work at all. There's a smaller possibility it makes things worse before it makes them better, temporary distortion, disorientation, before any potential improvement stabilizes. And if I don't try it?" "Then you stay exactly as you are," she said. "Which is, for what it's worth, a life you've already proven you can build. I won't pretend this is an easy decision, or that I'm neutral about which answer I want you to give." I appreciated, more than I expected to, that she said that last part out loud instead of pretending otherwise. That night, unable to settle the storm of hope and fear tangled together in my chest, I found Natalie in the same kitchen, the same midnight tea between her hands, as if she'd been waiting. "I'm scared," I told her, without preamble, because some nights honesty is the only thing you have energy left for. "Of the treatment failing?" she asked. "That too," I said. "But there's something else underneath it. What if it works? What if I see you both, clearly, for the first time, and everything I felt toward you these past weeks turns out to have only existed because I was vulnerable and scared, and you were the safest thing in the room? What if the bond isn't real, once I don't need you to survive anymore?" Natalie was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was careful, deliberate. "I can't promise you the bond will feel exactly the same once you can see us," she said. "I don't think anyone can promise that about anything, but I can promise you this. Whatever you feel once you can see clearly gets to be the truth, not an obligation to something you felt while blind and frightened. If it's different, it's different. We'll deal with that honestly, not pretend it away." "That's not exactly reassuring," I said, half a laugh escaping despite myself. "No," she agreed, "but it's true, and I'd rather give you something true than something comfortable." I chose the treatment 2 days later. The procedure itself was strange and disorienting. a series of careful injections directly into tissue I couldn't see being worked on. Hours of stillness in a darkened room while Alina monitored readings I had no way of interpreting myself. Natalie's hand resting lightly, with permission asked and given, over mine the entire time. I counted my own heartbeats through most of it, an old trick from the earliest, hardest days of my blindness. Something to anchor my mind to rather than the fear of what was happening to a part of my body I couldn't see or fully understand. Alina narrated occasionally. Quiet updates meant less for medical necessity and more, I suspected, for my own comfort, a voice threading through the dark to remind me I wasn't alone in it. The waiting period after was the hardest part, 7 days of bandages and uncertainty, of not knowing whether hope had been a gift or a cruelty I'd chosen for myself. I filled the days as best I could, teaching Sage a card game by touch, listening to Natalie read aloud from a novel she swore she'd chosen at random and clearly hadn't, the story suspiciously full of characters finding their way home against long odds. On the 5th day, my nerve nearly broke entirely, a wave of panic rising so suddenly I had to excuse myself from the room, finding my way by memory to the same kitchen where midnight conversations had slowly become a habit of ours. Natalie found me there within minutes, not saying anything at first, simply sitting beside me until my breathing evened out enough to speak. "What if it doesn't work?" I finally said. "Then we keep going," she said simply. "The same way we've kept going through everything else so far. One version of your life isn't a failure just because it isn't the version you hoped for." It wasn't the reassurance I expected to hear. It was, somehow, exactly the reassurance I needed. On the 7th day, Alina began removing the gauze, layer by careful layer, her fingers steady, her voice low and quiet, narrating each step so I wouldn't be startled by the touch. "Almost there," she said on the final layer. "Whenever you're ready." I wasn't sure I would ever be ready. I nodded anyway. The room went dark first, darker than my blindness had ever actually been, some final protective layer removed and nothing yet to replace it. Then, impossibly, a point of light. Not memory, not imagination. Light. I gasped, my whole body going rigid, Natalie's hand tightening around mine on one side, Alina going very still on the other. The light spread slowly, resolving into blurred shapes, color bleeding in at the edges of vague, moving forms. I blinked, over and over, my eyes aching with disuse and effort, and slowly, painfully slowly, the shapes began to sharpen. A small outline, close to the bed, unmistakably a child's shape, unmistakably Sage, standing on his toes trying to see over the edge of the mattress. "Vivi," he said, his voice tight with hope. "I see you," I said, my voice breaking entirely. "Sage, I can see you." Beyond him, 2 more shapes resolved, close together, close to me, both of them impossibly still, as if afraid movement might undo whatever miracle was happening in front of them. I turned toward the shape on my left first. A woman's face slowly came into focus, sharp cheekbones, a jaw held tight with worry she wasn't quite managing to hide, dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Alina," I said, testing the name against the face for the first time. Her composed expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the relief underneath it. I turned to my right. A second face, nearly identical in bone structure, entirely different in the way it held itself, softer around the eyes, a small, trembling smile already forming before I'd even finished turning. "Natalie," I said. "Hi," she said, her voice thick. "It's nice to finally get introduced properly." I laughed, wet and startled, tears finally spilling over now that there was something for them to fall in front of. And then, faint but unmistakable, I saw something neither of them could have shown me on purpose. Something threaded in the air between the 3 of us. A shimmer of gold and silver light, barely visible, pulsing gently in time with my own racing heartbeat. "What is that?" I whispered, afraid to look away from it, afraid it would vanish if I did. "The bond," Alina said quietly. "You're seeing it. Most people never do, not even bonded pairs. It usually takes years of trust before it becomes visible." "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it completely. We sat together for a long while after that, Sage eventually climbing fully onto the bed to press himself against my side. None of us saying much, all of us simply existing in the quiet, overwhelming relief of a moment none of us had been entirely sure would arrive. Later, once Sage had fallen asleep curled against me, and the room had settled into something calmer, I found the words I'd been circling since the bandages came off. "I need to say something," I told them both, "and I need you to actually hear it, not just accept it politely." They both went still, waiting. "You gave me back my sight," I said. "That doesn't buy my love. I need you to know that whatever I choose next, it's not gratitude talking. It's not the bond deciding for me either. It's me choosing with my eyes open in every sense of the word." "We know," Alina said quietly. "Good," I said, "because I'm choosing you anyway, both of you, not because of what you did for me, because of who you've been every single day since that elevator when you didn't have to be." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it, warm instead of tense, full instead of uncertain. Natalie reached for my hand again, this time simply because she wanted to, not because I needed steadying, and I let her, and the gold and silver thread between us pulsed brighter for just a moment before settling into something steadier, something that felt unmistakably like home. The peace didn't last as long as any of us wanted it to. 9 days after my sight returned, the penthouse security systems failed all at once, lights dropping into darkness floor by floor. An alarm blaring for exactly 4 seconds before it, too, went silent. "Meridian," Alina said instantly, already moving, her voice sharp and controlled in the sudden dark. "They know the treatment worked. They know what that proves about their compound." I felt my heart drop into something cold and familiar, the same helpless dread I'd carried into that first elevator ride weeks ago, except this time I understood exactly what was at stake, and exactly how much I now had to lose. Smoke began filtering in from the ventilation, thin at first, then thicker, disorienting in a way that made my newly restored vision suddenly, cruelly, useless again, everything reduced to vague, shifting shapes in choking gray haze. "Sage," I said, reaching for him in the chaos, finding his small hand already gripping mine, trusting me completely even through his fear. "Stay close to me," Alina said, her voice cutting through the smoke. "Natalie, take the east corridor, I'll clear the—" A crash somewhere down the hall separated her sentence from its ending, and in the chaos that followed, I felt Natalie pulled away from me by the shifting crowd of security personnel now flooding the space, shouting instructions I could barely track through the smoke and noise. I called her name once, twice, and got no answer beyond the general roar of chaos swallowing every individual voice hole. For one terrifying moment, I was alone with Sage in a darkened, smoke-filled hallway, my restored vision worse than useless, blurred and burning from the haze, every hard-won piece of independence I'd built over the past weeks suddenly feeling as fragile as glass. And then, unexpectedly, something old and familiar surfaced in me, 3 weeks of learning to navigate an unlit world returning instantly, instinctively, the moment my eyes failed me again. I closed them. The world resolved instantly into something clearer than the smoke had allowed my eyes to see. Footsteps, 3 sets, 2 moving with the practiced rhythm of trained security, 1 moving wrong, uneven, unfamiliar, heavy-booted in a way none of the household staff wore. I pulled Sage tight against the wall, my hand over his mouth, gentle but firm, and listened, drawing on every hour of the past 3 weeks that had taught me exactly how to separate sound from noise, threat from safety, without a single visual cue to rely on. The wrong footsteps paused, close enough that I could hear breathing beneath a mask, could smell something chemical and sharp, beneath a synthetic disguise, scent clearly meant to hide an alpha signature from anyone still capable of detecting it. I knew that chemical smell. I'd smelled a version of it in my own hospital tests days earlier, the same synthetic signature that had stolen my sight 3 weeks before any of this began. My pulse spiked with a fear that had nothing abstract left in it anymore. "He's from Meridian," I whispered to Sage, barely audible. "Don't move, don't make a sound." The footsteps passed, close enough to touch, and continued down the corridor, unaware that the two of us were pressed silent and invisible against the wall just feet away. I counted his footsteps until they faded entirely, forcing my breathing to stay slow, steady, quiet for both our sakes. Once they'd passed, I moved fast, pulling Sage with me in the opposite direction, counting doorways by touch the way I'd counted everything for 3 blind weeks, until I found the small utility closet Natalie had shown me days earlier, tucked behind an unassuming panel most guests would never notice. "Stay here," I told Sage, guiding him inside, pressing a small flashlight I kept in my pocket now, out of old habit, into his hands. "Don't come out until you hear my voice or Alina's or Natalie's. No one else's. Do you understand?" He nodded, eyes wide but steady, trusting me completely, and I felt a fierce, aching pride in him even in the middle of everything, this small boy who had already survived so much worse than a house filled with smoke. I closed the door and turned back into the smoke, my eyes shut again, trusting the version of navigation that had never once failed me, not even tonight. I found the emergency access terminal exactly where Alina had once, almost in passing, mentioned its location during a security briefing I'd only half listened to at the time. My fingers found the keypad by memory, entering the emergency override code she'd given all of us on our first night here, a code I'd never expected to need. The system flickered, lights stuttering back to partial function floor by floor, alarms resuming their proper, piercing rhythm. Somewhere below me, I heard shouting, security finally converging on the intruder's location, his disguised scent no longer able to hide him once the ventilation cleared. I found Alina first, emerging from the smoke with a cut along her hairline and fury written across every line of her face, fury that softened instantly into something like relief the moment she saw me standing, upright, safe. "Sage," she said immediately. "Utility closet, East Corridor," I said. "He's safe. I need someone to get the recording from the access terminal live uploaded before Meridian's people realize the intrusion failed." I documented his scent signature, his gait, everything I could track without my eyes. It's enough to identify him. Alina stared at me for a moment, something complicated and proud moving across her expression. "You navigated a compromised building, in smoke, without your restored sight, and still managed evidence collection," she said. "I had practice," I said. 3 weeks of it, as it turns out. Natalie found us moments later, unharmed but breathless, and the 3 of us stood together in the slowly clearing corridor, the immediate danger past, the larger fight only just beginning in earnest. The evidence I'd gathered, combined with months of Alina and Natalie's own investigation, proved decisive in a way none of us had quite dared to hope for. The intruder, once identified through the access terminal recording and cross-referenced against Meridian Vault's own security logs, turned out to be a mid-level executive with direct access to the compound's original formulation records. Under pressure from mounting evidence, he cooperated quickly, trading testimony for a reduced sentence, and the documentation he provided exposed nearly 2 years of quiet, calculated harm, dozens of unexplained blindness cases across 3 states. Every one of them a deliberate test of a compound designed to create desperate, paying customers for a controlled antidote Meridian had never intended to release cheaply, or to everyone. I sat in on part of the deposition process, at Alina's careful, repeated insistence that I only do so if I genuinely wanted to, not out of any obligation to the case. Hearing the scope of it laid out, name after name, case after case, each one a stranger who had woken up one morning with their sight simply gone, the way mine had, was harder than I expected. It also, unexpectedly, gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense that my own blindness, however frightening it had been, had not been meaningless or random. It had been evidence, and evidence, once gathered, could be used to stop it from happening to anyone else. Sage asked me once, in the quiet, careful way children sometimes ask the hardest questions, whether the bad man from the smoke was the same kind of bad as our mother. I thought about the question longer than I expected to before answering. "Different kind of bad," I told him. "But both kinds hurt people who trusted them not to. That's usually the pattern with people who do this kind of harm. They count on being trusted first. He seemed to accept that answer, filing it away the way children do, and didn't ask again. The story broke publicly within a week, Alina and Natalie choosing, deliberately, not to center themselves in it, letting the evidence and the victims' own voices carry the weight of the exposure instead. Meridian's executives were arrested in a coordinated series of raids that made national news for exactly the length of time such stories usually hold public attention before the next crisis replaces it. Their assets were frozen, a portion of them redirected. Through legal channels Alina's company had apparently been quietly preparing for over a year, directly toward compensation for victims and continued funding of the very treatment that had restored my own sight. Alina and Natalie made a decision, once the dust settled, that surprised even people who'd known them for years, according to the quiet, admiring gossip I occasionally overheard from their staff. They released the treatment protocol under an accessible pricing model, refusing to allow their own miracle to become the same kind of controlled dependency Meridian had tried to build around a stolen version of it. Within 6 months, hundreds of patients across the affected states had regained their sight. I met several of them eventually at a quiet event Alina and Natalie held without press coverage, just patients and their families gathered in a room that felt, for once, entirely free of danger. I was asked, more than once that evening, how I'd ended up connected to the Vale sisters at all, my story having become, despite our best efforts at privacy, a quietly circulated piece of the larger narrative. I pressed the wrong button, I told them, more than once, watching understanding and warmth move across each face as they heard it, and reached the only floor where someone was waiting to see me. My mother never resurfaced, not in any way that mattered. Legal proceedings regarding Sage's custody moved forward quietly and decisively, Alina's resources ensuring nothing about the process could be delayed or manipulated the way I'd feared it might be. Within 2 months, custody was fully, permanently mine, with no further contact required or permitted from the woman who had once locked a frightened 6-year-old in a storage closet and walked away. I won't pretend the finality of that didn't carry its own quiet grief alongside the relief. She was still my mother, whatever else she had failed to be, and some small, stubborn part of me mourned the version of her I'd always hoped, against all evidence, might eventually show up. Natalie sat with me through that grief without trying to talk me out of it, understanding, somehow, that relief and sadness could occupy the same evening without contradicting each other. Sage started school that autumn, a bright, resilient boy who told anyone who asked that he lived with his sister and the twins, a description that made Alina roll her eyes fondly every single time and made Natalie laugh outright. His teacher mentioned, at the first parent conference, that he'd drawn a family portrait for a class assignment, 4 figures instead of the usual 2 or 3, and had explained with total confidence that families could be exactly as many people as loved you enough to stay. Our home, once temporary refuge, slowly transformed into something none of us had explicitly planned, but all of us had, in our own separate ways, been building toward since that first night. Guest rooms became shared spaces. Sage's tactile chessboard found a permanent place on the living room table, well worn from nightly games with Alina that he was slowly, stubbornly, beginning to win. A fact he announced to anyone within earshot the first time it actually happened. Alina's pride in the loss somehow more visible than any victory she'd ever had in a boardroom. Mornings in that house were chaos in the best possible sense. 3 adults and 1 increasingly opinionated 6-year-old negotiating breakfast, homework, and the small, ordinary logistics of a life none of us had expected, but all of us had come to treasure. Alina handled logistics with her usual precision, schedules pinned neatly to a board by the door. Natalie handled the inevitable small disasters, spilled cereal, missing shoes, last-minute permission slips, with a patience that never seemed to run out no matter how chaotic the morning got. I found my own role somewhere in between, the steady, grounding presence that both the household and, I slowly realized, both alphas themselves seemed to lean on more than they'd probably admit out loud. The bond between the 3 of us settled, over the following months, into something steadier than the overwhelming intensity of that first night, deepened by choice made daily rather than by instinct alone. I learned the specific quality of Alina's silences, the ones that meant worry and the ones that meant simple contentment. I learned the particular warmth in Natalie's voice reserved only for the two people, three now, she trusted completely. There were adjustments neither of them had anticipated needing to make, and to their credit, they made them without complaint. Alina learned to soften her instructions into requests, catching herself the few times old habits of command crept back into her voice. Natalie learned that comfort, offered too quickly or too often, could occasionally feel like being managed rather than cared for, and learned to ask, more and more, what I actually needed instead of assuming she already knew. I learned things, too, about myself as much as about them. I learned that accepting help wasn't the same as losing the independence I'd fought so hard to rebuild after losing my sight. I learned that love, real love, wasn't a debt collected from either of them for what they'd given me, but something offered freely, in both directions, renewed every day by the small, unglamorous choice to keep showing up for each other. The gold and silver thread between the three of us, visible now whenever I let myself truly look for it, grew steadier with every month that passed, less a fragile, overwhelming thing, and more something woven, deliberately, out of 100 small moments none of us had planned in advance. 1 year, almost exactly, after the elevator first carried me somewhere I never meant to go, I found myself back in the lobby of the Holloway Medical Tower, there for a routine follow-up scan. Nothing urgent, simply confirmation that my restored sight remained stable. The lobby looked different to me than it had a year earlier, not because it had changed, but because I had. I remembered standing in nearly this exact spot, cane in hand, silently counting the seconds of an elevator ride I had no way of verifying, bracing myself for a world I could no longer see coming. Now I stood there simply watching people move through the space, a mother juggling a stroller and a coffee cup, an elderly man reading a newspaper by the window, ordinary details I had once had to imagine rather than observe, details I no longer took for granted even a year later. The elevator waited, doors open, panel repaired now, brass buttons gleaming under lights I could finally, fully see. I could see the number 14 clearly. I could also see, one row above it, the button for the private penthouse level, the one that had, by accident, changed the entire shape of my life. I stood there for a moment, remembering the blind, frightened woman who had once counted these same buttons by touch alone, certain she was pressing 14, entirely unaware of what waited above her. I thought about how much fear had lived in me that day, how completely unprepared I'd been for anything that followed. The gunfire, the rescue, the slow, careful unraveling of trust into something I now couldn't imagine my life without. I pressed the penthouse button instead. The doors closed, and the elevator began its climb, deliberate this time, chosen this time, carrying me toward exactly where I wanted to go. I watched the floor numbers illuminate one by one, a small, private pleasure I still hadn't grown tired of, each number a tiny, ordinary miracle I no longer had to take on faith. When the doors opened, Alina and Natalie were already there, waiting, the way they always seemed to be now, Sage between them clutching a chess piece he'd apparently smuggled out of the house for reasons only a 7-year-old could fully explain. "You're early," Alina said, the corner of her mouth lifting in the small, private smile she rarely showed anyone else. "I wanted to be," I said, stepping out to meet them. Sage held up his chess piece triumphantly. "I'm going to beat her today," he announced, nodding toward Alina with the fierce confidence of a boy who had lost 40 consecutive games and remained entirely undeterred. "You said that yesterday," Natalie pointed out, laughing. "Today's different," he said, with total conviction and something about his certainty, his easy, unguarded belief that good things were simply owed to arrive eventually if you kept showing up for them, struck me as the truest lesson any of us had learned this past year. The first time, I had reached the top by mistake. Every time after that, standing now in a doorway full of the family I had never expected to find in a broken elevator panel, I chose it, and I intended to keep choosing it, one ordinary, deliberate day at a time, for as long as any of us were lucky enough to have.